Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 20 of the Ask Historians podcast. Today, I, your humble interlocutor for Wonder Rabbits, will be talking to Ambarinia about what we originally intended to just be a one quick podcast on the Komnenian Dynasty of the Byzantines, kind of their last great dynasty before they started just kind of falling to outside and internal pressures. But we got a little carried away. Ambarinia is actually quite passionate about this, as I learned when he, in fact, when we were talking about armor about, I think like maybe 20 minutes in, he picked up and shook something that sounded like armor in the background, and later on I asked him, so what was that you were shaking? And yes, that is, he just happened to have some replica Byzantine armor that was on his desk just while we were talking. So I've asked him to put up some pictures about that, but that is the kind of madness I'm dealing with here. So we went a bit over. This first podcast will actually cover the Macedonian Dynasty, more of their fall and the chaos that came afterwards, and end kind of on the beginning of the Komnenian Dynasty with Alexios the First around the Battle of Dyrrhachium, kind of having secured the western borders and having to look east. So it ends on a bit of cliffhanger, a cliffhanger if you've never heard of the Ottomans, I suppose. Although, you know, who knows? Maybe we're rewriting history as we speak here, and you know, Constantinople was going to be conquered a few centuries earlier. You'll never find out unless you listen. But this is, as you may have guessed by the fact that I'm referencing a bunch of battles and emperors and such, this is very much a kind of blood and guts and politics kind of podcast. These two episodes are. So if you're looking for kind of information and dirt on the iconoclasm and the spread of the Cyrillic alphabet, this isn't really the one for here. This is very much kind of chest-thumping armies meeting together, and, you know, victory snatched from the jaws of defeat and defeat snatched from the jaws of victory. So, but it was a lot of fun to make, and Ambarinia is a great speaker on this, given his passion, his very obvious passion. So I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Ask Historians podcast. Today I'm talking to Ambarinia, who is our Byzantine expert, or one of our Byzantine experts, and today we'll be covering the Komnenoi, the Komnenian Dynasty, which was a 12th century, I believe. You can correct me if I'm getting this wrong.
Around 12th, late 11th and 12th.
Yeah,
yep.
Late 11th, 12th century dynasty, which is seen as kind of restoring the Byzantine Empire to a bit of an earlier glory, but it was a time marked primarily by constant conflict. But before we get into that, Ambarinia, why don't you go ahead and tell us about what got you interested in the Byzantines?
Well, it's actually an interesting story of how how I became interested in Byzantium. It was actually one of the classes that I took when I was in college. Was on late Roman. Basically, it was on empire and history, and I had a choice of whether I could study various empires in history, and one of them, which I had always had an interest in, was the Roman Empire, of course. But one thing that had really always struck me about the Roman Empire and the way it was taught was that it was always about the height of the Roman Empire. It was never about what led to the decline of the Roman Empire. It was almost like a dark area. At least for me in my educational process before I had, really gotten into Byzantium in the late Roman Empire.
Almost like you might say a Dark Ages?
Yes, indeed. Very much like a Dark Ages or a Dark Age in my, quote unquote, historical knowledge. It was a huge gap. So when I took this Empire and History course, I was really, I had no idea really of what happened. I had some vague understanding that there was this Eastern Roman Empire, that there was, there was a huge decline in West, there were barbarian invasions, and various other things that led up to the fall of the Western Roman Empire and what I had seen as the fall of Rome. But then as time went on and I had done more research, I read Vigidis' De Re Militari, and that was, of course, one of the manuals in the late Roman Empire of, how Vigidis and the emperors felt about their military and about their prestige and about how they viewed their empire. And it was very interesting to me to realize that they had some really interesting military innovations, but they knew that their empires was seeming to fall, that things were not as they once were. And that's very apparent in De Re Militari. And so I went on and kept learning about, well, what happened next? Then I got into the reign of Honorius, the splitting of the empire after the death of Theodosius I, and learned about the split of the empire. and then I got into what really drove me to my love of Byzantium, which was at the end all that was left was Byzantium versus this whole plethora of enemies. And it's just for me it's an inspiring story that without really anyone to help them, they were allowed to survive for over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. And it's just the thing that drives me is just to learn what was it that allowed them to survive against this host of enemies when really by all accounts they should have fallen, but they didn't, and they hung on, and they had 3 major revivals throughout their history. And that's really what drives me, is to learn how did they do it. And I think that's something that is brought up. I think it's in Treadgold, A History of Byzantine State and Society. He says something along the lines of, maybe we shouldn't be asking, what it was that led to their decline, but we should be asking what it was that they did right that allowed them to survive. So it's very interesting, and of course that's really what brought me into my element with Byzantium.
So that is an interesting take. I think a lot of people, when they think of the Byzantine Empire, if they think of it at all, unfortunately, it's seen as almost kind of a rump state on this glory of this the Western Roman Empire. So it's an interesting idea to see it as, well, it's not simply a rump state that slowly collapsed like a poorly made flan for 1,000 years. It existed and thrived for 1,000 years, even if it did have a few setbacks. So
yes.
It's weird to see that. It's an interesting take to look at that as an optimistic thing rather than kind of an almost as embarrassing, creepy uncle to the Western Roman Empire. Of course, we're going to start with the less optimistic period, because before the Komnenos, the dynasty that we're going to focus on mostly, there was a period of chaos, but before that was one of those kind of restoration highlight periods that you had referred to, which is the Macedonians. And we're not going to focus on them. We're just going to focus on, to keep it this theme of pessimism, their fall. So fill us in on what was going on with the end of the Macedonian dynasty and the effects that was having.
Okay, so yeah, let's just do a brief background on what led up, as you said, what led up to the period where with Alexios' restoration of the empire and so on. So let's go back. So Alexios took control in 1081 AD, and we're going to go back about, let's say, 70 or 80 years. We might even go back a little farther. We'll go back about 150 years. So as you may or may not know, the Macedonian Dynasty of Byzantium was, I believe, the longest-lived dynasty throughout their history. It was arguably the greatest one, and it accomplished a great deal. But as you probably know, Byzantium, as you said, had a lot of setbacks. It had a lot of eras where things did not go as were planned. And one of the huge setbacks, of course, was the events that led up to the Arab invasions, during which Byzantium lost over 50% of its territory. All that was essentially left was Asia Minor, which is present-day Turkey, and Greece, and maybe some small bits of the Balkans. And when that happened, the empire kind of went into this shock mode. They went into basically lockdown. There was nothing they could really do to fight off these Arabs other than to solidify what was left of the empire. And so that was what they did. Now, out of that era, there was a couple series of relatively short-lived dynasties, which right before the Macedonians came to power was the era of iconoclasm, where they essentially tried to remove the icons from the churches because they believed that their losses against the Arabs were caused by the fact that God was angry at them. So anyways, after that era, and there was a lot of political and religious strife during that period, but out of that era comes the Macedonian Dynasty, and it was started by Basil I in 867 when he came to the throne. And so for a long period of time, and it was shown throughout the various reigns of those Macedonian emperors that the Macedonian emperors were quite effective at ruling. They solidified the governance of the empire. They solidified most of the religious turmoils, and they also really solidified the military. And it was really the military aspect of this thing that really was what brought them to the height of their power. And so by the end of
If I could just
go
jump
ahead.
in,
Sorry.
so what exactly was the innovation, or at least what made the Macedonian military so effective? Because I think we're going to kind of compare and contrast that with Alexios and the rest later. So, what was the secret of the Macedonians?
There were a lot of major military innovations that were made under the Macedonians. Most of them really didn't come to fruition until the latter part of their reign, and that was with you had emperors like Nikephoros Phokas, John Tzimiskes, these really great leaders that knew how to really combine a lot of different ideas. But one major development was made, and it wasn't really by the guy who made it was not really a great military leader, was Leo VI, who was he reigned in, I think he died in 912, so he was one of the earlier Macedonian emperors. He wrote the Tactica of, and it's of course known as the Tactica of Leo VI. And the Tactica was a major military innovation because it is considered even today the first combined arms and tactics manual in the world. And what this did for the Byzantine military was it allowed their generals to have essentially a standardized system of knowing how to deal with all these various enemies they fought against: the Arabs, the Turks, the Pechenegs, all of these guys, who had various tactics that they used in battle. The Tactica goes over and tells you exactly how to deal with them, exactly how Byzantine generals in the past had dealt with them, as military maxims, explains exactly how to organize the military, and it's a pretty hefty tome. I have it right here. It's a pretty big tome. It's has a lot of detail in it, and I think that was one major thing that allowed Byzantium to really kind of solidify the organization of its military during this period. So while Leo VI was really more of a philosopher emperor, and he had his own scandals in the political life, but he really was, with that Tactica, he really did a lot. And the other thing too is I want to briefly mention that he was a very prolific writer, and another thing he did during his reign was he solidified the Basilica Code of Laws, which essentially was a rehashing of Justinian's great Corpus Juris Civilis, which is the great law manual that was created back in 500s. So by taking that and by redeveloping it, he also was able to solidify the government as well. And one minor note, and this is an interesting tidbit of history, even about 700 years later, when the Greeks won their independence in 1821, they used Leo VI Basilica as their code of laws for 13 years, which is very tells you how effective it was.
Robust.
Yeah, it was definitely robust, and it was very ingrained in the obviously ingrained in the people, even when they had been under the rule of the Ottomans for 400 years or so. But anyways, getting back to our talk about the Macedonians and what they did, like I said, you had that the Tactica was a major innovation, but you also had a number of other things that allowed the Macedonians to succeed, and that was during the time of Nikephoros Phokas, John Tzimiskes, those guys. There was a kind of a shift of the focus of the military more towards these super heavy cavalry, the return of the Klebanopheroi, these really heavily armored cavalry units that were used as shock units in battle. They were designed to basically jump right into the fray, and they were so heavily armored that they couldn't be easily killed by regular weapons, especially the weapons used by the Turks and the Arabs, because the armor was just so thick. I actually have right here some examples of these Klevanion plates. The Klevanion itself was basically an analog to modern body armor in essence. It had all these interwoven small plates. It was a type of lamellar armor, but it had tons of layers, and this was what allowed these horsemen to just kind of charge into the fray and really really do some damage. And the thing is, Nikephoros Phokas wrote his own military manual, and that was really it really describes how the Byzantine military at this point is to use a number of other things, other tactics that were developed during the time, which was first was the hammer and anvil kind of style of attacking. So they would kind of have the cavalry just repeatedly charge into enemies to kind of like just wear them down, whittle down their morale, whittle down their number of troops and break their cohesion and just make them, flee. And the other thing too was there's a kind of almost a terror doctrine of basically using Greek fire. They had these siphons that they would actually use, and these were little handheld siphons, and they would actually bring them up to basically the front of the line, and they'd shoot the Greek fire into the enemy lines, and they would break up all the formations, and that was what allowed the cavalry to charge in because all the formations were broken. So there's some really brilliant tactics that were used by Nikephoros Phokas specifically and his successors that allowed the Macedonian military to really dominate the Mediterranean world during their height of their power. So.
But of course, that height of power, of course, implies a downfall. So what this sounds like brilliant tactics. You have these essentially invulnerable cavalry charging in after the front ranks of the enemy opposing troops have basically been hit with flamethrowers. So what brought down this invincible Macedonian Byzantine army? Did their tactics get outdated? Did they lose expertise? What happened there?
Well, that's the thing is, actually, interestingly enough, it was really the political situation that brought the downfall of the Macedonian Dynasty, and I'll explain to you why. So, as I said, you have really starting with Nikephoros Phokas and going on. Actually, it started a little bit earlier, under Romanos II and under Constantine VII. There have been a number of attacks, really reconquests of a lot of the islands in that were once Byzantine that had been taken over by the Arabs, and so there was an invasion of Crete, and that happened. There were a couple invasions of Crete actually. They're documented in Constantine VII's De Ceremoniis, but there's also under Romanos they actually succeeded. And even though Romanos wasn't really that great of a leader because he only ruled for a couple of years before he died, he was a sickly person. But yeah, they were able to retake a lot of these islands. And so once they retook those islands, that was when they started to push back, all these enemies, and they really were able to, solidify their position. So as time went on, you had, of course, Nikephoros Phokas, who was known as the White Death of the Saracens. That was his nickname because he beat them so many times. You had John Tzimiskes, who crushed basically everyone who he fought against. And even got down into like the Antioch area, and I think he had ambitions to even attack Jerusalem and retake it during his reign. But he didn't reign for that long either. But then by 976, you have the final accession of Basil II. And Basil II is an interesting story because not only was he the longest, I think he was the longest reigning Byzantine emperor other than maybe Justinian, but he, under his early years, he was kind of kept away from the throne because there were all these other people like Nikephoros Phokas and John Tzimiskes. These guys were great generals, and they kind of like took over the throne. They didn't really allow the true heirs, and Basil II was one of them. There were two. There was Constantine VIII and Basil II. And these two young sons of Romanos II were basically kept away from the throne while these great military leaders kind of like took charge. And I mean, like Nikephoros Phokas and John Tzimiskes, they didn't like do what a lot of other Byzantine leaders did in the past, which was they kind of like depose the younger monarchs or emperors or to be emperors. But the thing is, they did kind of like take over the throne for a time. But
kept
once
them around as a figurehead, essentially.
Yeah, they were there as figureheads. I mean, the thing was the Macedonian dynasty was a pretty long-lived dynasty even at that point. So they didn't want to remove it from power. And actually, this will come back to be very very interesting thing. You'll find that the people were very proud of that dynasty. So when they tried to remove them, it didn't turn out pretty. So, anyways, finishing up with what we were talking about. Basil didn't come to the throne until I think he was 25 or 30 or something like that. He had spent such a long period of time under the yoke of these two great military leaders that by the time he came to the throne, he was already an kind of a middle-aged man, or maybe he might have been a little bit younger, but he definitely was he wasn't a kid.
Middle-aged man.
Yeah, he wasn't a kid, but he definitely came to the throne at an older age. But when he came to the throne, he has a very interesting story in the way he lived his life. early on, he was very much like most Byzantine emperors. He loved life, he loved women, he loved wine. He did all these crazy things that would not really be becoming of royalty, right? But then he had a kind of an experience where there was a great rebellion, and I think he faced off in battle against one of the rebels, the great rebels. I think it was Bardas, if I'm not mistaken. You can correct me on that one. I'm doing this off the top of my head, so I can't do. I'm doing my best. So yeah, Bardas, if I remember correctly, was this like big. He was like Goliath. He was like this huge guy, and Basil saw this guy, and he saw how great of a leader he was, and how dangerous these rebellions were, and that really changed him in what happened. He eventually won the battle, but the thing, and it was because I think Bardas had like an aneurysm or something, or a heart attack while he was on his horse while he was charging, and he just died right there in the battlefield, and the rebels scattered. But it was I think Basil might have ascribed it to like a stroke of luck, by God, right? Like striking him down. That's actually what they say in the actual sources. They say it looked as if he was struck down by God. But I think Basil was very changed by that, because he saw how dangerous that rebellion could be, and he became a very austere man, very serious man. He had a huge change, and it's documented in a couple of sources, specifically Michael Sellis' sources. But anyways, getting on to what I was trying to say. Basil II, for the rest of his years, reigned as a very serious man. Very, very. He almost had an anger about him. They say he's a very gruff man. So he ruled really with an iron fist. But the thing about Basil that's interesting is that Basil never had any children. And the thing that was really dangerous was that if you don't have any children with a great dynasty like that, what happens, right? Especially because of his long reign.
So question here, what exactly was the inheritance laws of the Byzantine, I guess the emperor at this point? Was it strictly that it needed to be someone from his own family, or did you have that kind of thing where they could appoint a successor outside their family? Or was it even codified that strictly?
As far as I know, the succession was not codified, and that this is pretty evident if you look at the way that the emperors succeeded each other. Back in like the 700s or so, when you have like Constans II and those guys, there's still like an element of that Roman adoption process. And even until really right before the rise of the Macedonians, you kind of have a couple examples of that. But when you get into the time of the Macedonians, the succession is generally a direct succession. So you have, whoever's the son or daughter of a reigning emperor or of the previous emperor will be the ruler. And if there's no one, as we'll see with Basil II, whoever's considered to be the highest or eldest or most capable of the emperor's relatives will become the leader. So and I'll explain to you how this works with Basil. So, and as we go on, we're going to definitely get into what actually happened here. So with Basil, there was he died in 1025 without a child, and he had done very many things during his life. He had basically conquered and subdued everyone around him, and Byzantium had almost no enemies. The army was at the height of its power. The coffers were exploding with gold. But again, his greatest failure was that he never had any children. So when he died, the Byzantine elite were basically like, well, what the heck do we do? Basil was such a great leader. How are we going to replace him? So they finally decided, well, all we can do is we got his brother here, and his brother was Constantine the Eighth was an old man. He was an old man by this point. He was like 65 years old. He had never had any ambitions to be emperor, and so it was basically just like, okay, we'll let him do his thing, but we really don't know what we're gonna do after he kicks the bucket. So
just kind of a placeholder, essentially.
He really was a placeholder. So basically, Constantine rules for 3 years and dies. He does nothing during that time period. He had basically been the exact opposite of what Basil was throughout most of his life. He loved wine, women, and everything else, but he never expected to rule. So after he died, and I know we only have a limited amount of time. I'm just gonna kind of explain very quickly what happened. Basically, in the end, the Macedonian dynasty died out because the people who succeeded Basil II were not only incapable of taking his place, but also were too old to continue the dynasty. So what happened was, after Constantine VIII died, there was you had Zoe and Theodora, who were relatives, of course. I think the daughters of I'm trying to remember. It was one of the previous emperors. It might have even been Romanus II. So at that point, they had been pretty old. I think Zoe was like 50 years old when she was acceded to the throne, so to speak. But because the Byzantines needed someone to they needed like a male ruler, she had to marry someone. So she married Romanos Argyros, and that didn't turn out too well. He started out all right at first, but then he kind of descended into madness. He wanted to be another Marcus Aurelius, and he started building all these buildings, but he didn't succeed. And then you have a series of other emperors that, again, don't really continue the line. Zoe's too old to have any children. Theodora's too old to have any children. So at the very end, in 1055 and 1056, you have Zoe and Theodora running the show. They're very popular amongst the people because they're part of the Macedonian dynasty, but again, they're too old to have any children. And so in the end, with their death, the Macedonian dynasty dies out. So
there's the idea of continuing the dynasty through essentially the female side, and I assume they were serving as the head of state, as empresses. Or I guess there's actually, I assume there is a proper Greek term for it at this point, but there is the expectation that they needed to have a husband who could carry out the kind of military and more male-oriented political duties.
Yes. Yep. And at this point, it actually started to get kind of dangerous because that male duty was to lead the military, right? And if you know anything about Byzantium, the military was the life force of the empire. If you did not have a good military leader as the Byzantines, you're not going to do too well, and it shows time and time again throughout their history. So the thing was, Basil II, he led personally. He did, and he had a lot of great generals too that led under him, and he really did a lot to further the military of Byzantium. But when he died, again, his brother was not capable of being a leader. He never wanted to be a leader, so he didn't do anything to continue. He was an old man by that point, so it didn't work out, in that sense. And again, with Zoe and Theodora, there is some evidence to suggest that Zoe, if it were acceptable in the society for an empress to lead, she probably would have. But again, she was barred by that because of her status as a woman, right? So there's a lot of interesting dynamics to see in that, and later on you'll see that same kind of mentality with Anna Komnena, and we'll get into her when we talk about the Komneni.
At this point, it's the end of the Macedonian line. What kind of threats and external threats, I guess we should point out, what kind of threats was the Byzantine Empire facing at this point?
Okay, so yeah, it's a great question. So at this point in time, so really we'll start with Basil II's death. So after he died, like I said, right at his death, there were no enemies, really. The enemies had all been subdued. The Bulgars, you probably heard the famous story of, he blinded 15,000 Bulgars and left, one eye, each of them with one eye, or like every 10th man with one eye so they could lead the rest of them. You probably heard that story, but that's the legend of Basil. But after he died, really all the great military bulwarks, there was a great bulwark in Armenia. He had set up all this grand defensive network made up of various themes that had been basically reestablished during his reign and even before his reign.
Before you go on, could you briefly describe the theme system? Because
yes.
I think that may be something that not everyone is very familiar with.
Yeah, sure. So the theme system comes from the Greek word thema, And it basically was a system that was, I think there's a little bit of controversy over who established it, but from what I've seen, the general consensus among scholars is that Constans II, way back in the 7th century, was the one who first established the theme system. It was a system by which soldiers were settled on land that had been recaptured, and were set up as, basically farmers. And these farmers were supposed to be raised in times of war to supply the Byzantine military. The system was led by strategos, which was an interesting melding of both a general and a governor. So the strategos was like the supreme leader of this theme, and the theme was it was defined as a region, generally with some kind of, united ethnicity, especially as you got farther east. And kind of when you're near the center of the empire, it didn't really matter as much. But the themes were essentially designed so that they could be self-sufficient. And this actually became kind of dangerous in the early years of the theme system, because the strategy would rise up and attack this core of the empire under imperial holdings. So, but that was sorted out soon afterwards, and really for the rest of Byzantine history up until really the time of the Macedonians, the theme system was the real defensive network that Byzantium thrived on.
So back to the Bulgarian Armenian bulwarks of these themes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, these Armenian and Georgian network that was set up basically was there to prevent this new enemy, which had been found in the Far East after Basil had basically retaken all the way to around Lake Van, so that area. That's really far east in Anatolia. This new enemy was the Turks. The Turks had started, kind of pressuring the borders, and Basil, in his great foresight, was like, we need to build a bulwark to prevent these guys from coming into Anatolia. And he knew this because Anatolia, he knew from previous wars, especially from his predecessors with the Arabs, that the Arabs loved to stream through these passes in Anatolia, and it was very hard to stop them all because they would come through all of these various winding passageways, and there were tons of them. So it was difficult for the Byzantines to actually contain them once they actually got into the central plain of Anatolia. So this grand bulwark was there to prevent the Turks from really getting into the center, the heartland of the empire, because once they were there, it was very difficult to get them out.
Clearly, the Turks did get in at some point. So describe to us, if you would, to return back to this question about when the Macedonian, or essentially when Basil II, because it sounds like this is where everything started going wrong.
Yes.
He left an empire with, on very, very good footing with no visible enemies, but his less than capable successors, who were they facing? So we have the Turks coming in from the east, and these are the Seljuk Turks, I believe, right?
There was various Turkic peoples, but they would eventually form into the Seljuks. Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So, but we also see attacks from people coming in from the north, from up in Bulgaria and the Pechenegs, and we also see people coming in from the west. So, who are the threats coming in, and how were these late Macedonians and kind of this interregnum period dealing with those threats?
Okay, so again, with going with the theme that we're establishing here, is that really after Basil II, the attempts to stop these enemies were very feeble. One of the greatest failures occurred, I believe, under Romanos Argyros. If you remember, he was the one who married Zoe right after Constantine VIII died. Okay, so one of his greatest failures, not only, I think he had the economic system that he tried to establish failed miserably, but another great failure was that he completely disbanded the Armenian army, basically, in the east, the Grand Bulwark, right, to save money, because he wanted to save money to reestablish his great monetary system. So he basically disestablished that whole thing, and that was what started the issue, which allowed the Turks to kind of stream into the territory. Now we're talking about other enemies to the north, across the Danube frontier, which was really where the a lot of the issues had been before, right? In the early years of the Byzantine Empire, with like the Huns and the Avars, that was where these new threats, you had the Patzinaks or the Pechenegs. Those are probably the greatest threats. Great hordes that would kind of come streaming down through the across the Danube to attack various settlements. And after Basil II, there was no way, really very little way for the army of Byzantium to beat them. Now, it did happen a couple times. You have under Michael, I believe Michael IV, even in his sickness, he was able to muster one last, campaign to fight the Pechenegs and keep them at bay. But he's really the grand exception in that whole span of time, the interregnum period between Basil II and the start of the Komneni. So really, they were able to hold off the enemies, but with extreme difficulty. It's really only after the death of Theodora in 1056 that things really start to collapse. Although you see, even at the start of the 1040s, there was the revolt of Maniakes. Maniakes was George Maniakes was actually one of the best generals during this period. He had led a group of Italians in Italy, and he was very well renowned for his military prowess. But since the empire was being ruled so poorly, he felt that he was prime candidate for the imperial throne, so he mustered this great invasion force and invaded from Italy, what was then the Catepanate of Italia, and tried to cross the Strait of Otranto and invade the empire that way. But unfortunately, he died just before he landed. He died en route. So
put an end to that very quickly then.
Yeah, so it really dissolved right after that, and so that was really the end of that. But in terms of other enemies, you get really just very shortly after the death of Theodora, there had been brewing in Italy the start of the Sicilio-Normans, right? The de Hauteville family. You've probably heard of how I think it was like 8 or 12 brothers or something like that. They came through. They went through all various parts of Europe, and they started fighting as mercenaries. And one of the great mercenary leaders was Roberto Buscar, and he was the one who really started the Sicilio-Norman dynasty in southern Italy. So he was starting his rise during this period, and eventually it just came to a full-blown invasion of Byzantine southern Italy, and it was lost very shortly after the revolt of Maniakes, and that's what established a new great enemy on the borders of the empire, really just across the Strait of Otranto. But yeah, so there's the enemies that really arose during this period. You have, I'd probably say about by 1060. So we'll say, around 1060, you have the Normans starting to establish themselves in southern Italy. You have the Pechenegs and other various, steppe tribes on the north of the empire, with the Danube, beyond the Danube. You have the Turks, who are starting to pressure that eastern border, right, in Armenia. And to the south, you have, of course, the classic the Caliphate. So, and the Caliphate's having problems at this point, so it's starting to kind of crumble, and you have various other smaller factions. And this is actually would play into what allowed John Sumitskis and Nikiforos Phokas to actually make some gains during their reigns. So yeah, but you still have kind of a grand network of Muslim factions in the south that would eventually. They stay fragmented throughout most of the period. It was not really until you get the the rise of Saladin that it's reunited again. So.
But at this point, it's 1050, 1060. The Macedonian line is ended. I would guess there wasn't really any clear successor, and there's this whole host of enemies at completely surrounding them. So, what direction did the Byzantines take at this point? Who ascended the throne? How was that decided? What was the plans? Were there major defeats or major wins during this period? I know you mentioned one particular setback earlier, but how long was this period between the Macedonians and the Komnenians, and what set the stage for us there?
Okay, so so we're talking about the period after the Macedonians. So 1056, Theodora died. and that was the last of the Macedonians. And so really what happened afterwards was, so Theodora had appointed one of her closest advisors. His name was Joseph Bringas. And Bringas was, Michael Bringas. Forgive me. So Michael Bringas was just a favorite advisor. He didn't last very long. He only lasted a couple months as emperor because he had various enemy factions in the political scene. And eventually Isaac Komnenos was the one who succeeded him. Now, this is the interesting part of the rise of the Komneni. Before Alexios, there was actually one other Komnenian emperor, and that was Isaac, who ruled for 2 years. And during his reign, he did an extremely good job of basically consolidating the empire's forces and economy. He really stabilized it, kind of patchwork. He didn't do a permanent job. He didn't have enough time, but he was able to kind of reestablish the kind of security of the empire, at least for a short time. So it was really out of that original work by Isaac Komnenos that the Komnenian family really kind of started to rise in prominence. That was really the start of their rise. Now, going back during the time of Basil II, there was a general named Manuel Erotikos Komnenos, and he was really the progenitor of the Komnenian family. He was actually a very noted general during Basil's time, and so that was kind of the start of their rise of prestige. So with Isaac's appointment as emperor in 1057, that was like the culminating aspect that allowed the Komnenian family to become one of the great families of the Byzantine Empire. So that was really the start of it. Now, Isaac had a number of enemies also in the kind of political scene, and he was eventually he stepped down from power. He abdicated because he didn't want to see the empire fall into chaos again. The era of Joseph Bringas, or Michael Bringas, with his kind of, he just wasn't popular. He was an old guy. He was like a favorite advisor, and he had no real powerful claim to the throne, and so he was kind of just like a placeholder for a couple months before Isaac came to the throne. But after Isaac had his reign, it was really the rise of the Dukas family, and they were really the ones who took the reins after Isaac, and they reigned until I think it was until Romanos Diogenes. They ruled for about 10 years. I think, let's see, I'm trying to remember. I think it's Michael Dukas and Constantine Dukas. So yeah, you have those two guys.
So almost kind of a brief flash on the pan for that family, though. Yeah,
they don't. I mean, they hold prominence during that time, and actually even during the Komneni, they have the Komnenian period. They have quite a close ties to the Komnenian family because Alexios' wife, Irene, she was from the Dukas family. So there's like a pretty strong tie between the Komneni and the Dukas family throughout that period following. So really, after this brief reign of the Dukas family, like I said, Constantine, I think it was Constantine the 10th. You have Constantine the 9th Monomachos. He was the one who started that period after Isaac Komnenos, but then he reigned for a short period of time, and then Michael the 7th, and then Constantine the 10th. And then at the end of that, you have Romanos Diogenes come to the throne. And Romanos was chosen because he was a very he was a very well-noted veteran of the Danube frontier. The Byzantine people felt that they needed a strong military leader at this point because the Turks had started streaming in to Anatolia by this point. They started capturing a number of cities in the east. And so they felt that Romanos Diogenes was going to be the one who was going to finally restore the military glory of Byzantium. But unfortunately, by this time, the Byzantine army had essentially fallen apart. It hadn't been used in any real extensive way since really the 1040s. And so you have really just a almost complete collapse of the military. So Romanos Diogenes took the scraps of what was left, and he was able to basically take all those scraps, and then he hired a ton of mercenaries to fight for him, marched into Anatolia, central Anatolia, into the Far East, over by Manzikert. And of course, the rest is history. 1071, the Battle of Manzikert. It's considered one of the greatest blunders in Byzantine history. But the interesting thing is the blunder was not so much the military disaster, but really the political ramifications that occurred afterwards. And that really happened because Romanus Diogenes had a very tenuous claim. He basically was, he married an empress, and that was it. That was the only thing that he was really noted for. His family was not very well known, even though he came from a relatively rich family. They weren't they weren't considered really a great family at that point. He really had very little to support him.
He didn't have his own independent power base, is what you're saying.
Right, exactly. And he had difficulty in the court in establishing himself as his own political power. He really had, the only thing that really tied him to any sort of power was his marriage, and to the, I think it was Eudokia Micrumbolitisa, and she was the wife of previous emperor, or maybe two emperors. I don't remember exactly, but yeah. So Romanus Diogenes fails at Manzikert. He's sent back with a contingent of Turkish bodyguard because the Turkish Sultan, Alparslan, he basically said, Romanos, I'm not going to kill you. I pity you, and I'm going to let you go back to, He basically said in a famous exchange that I give you a far worse punishment. I will forgive you and set you free. And so he sent him back to Constantinople. And when Romanos got back to Constantinople, the people just absolutely destroyed him. They brought him down. They stripped him of all his titles. They exiled him to one of the Prince's Isles, and he died a lonely blind man. Absolutely terrible.
The Byzantines had a kind of a penchant for blinding people at this point, right?
Yes. Blinding was, well, the interesting thing is blinding seems to have like a kind of a eras where it's popular and eras where it's not. During this era, blinding was somewhat popular, and as you'll see in the later periods with the Komneni, blinding becomes less popular. It does not. It kind of like declines in popularity, and I think it's because the Komneni didn't really believe in that kind of mutilation, the political mutilation. They seem to have not really liked the idea. But during this period, definitely blinding was popular and did occur. And the reason that blinding became popular, and it really became popular in the era right around the Arab invasions and a little bit after. It was because they believed that blinding circumvented the basically religious law that was you're not supposed to kill, you can't, thou shalt not kill, right? They didn't want to murder someone, so they found that by blinding someone, you could essentially do the same job as murdering someone, because they wouldn't be considered for political succession, because there was a belief in the Byzantine succession that the emperor should be healthy. He should be visibly project the fact that he was the God's vice regent on earth. He didn't have any flaws. So that was part of the idea of political mutilation, was that anyone who was blinded was obviously not suited to be emperor, was not suited to have any high-ranking position because of that mutilation. So it was really a powerful political tool for them to blind. So
Michael Diogenes is blinded, and who takes over then?
Okay, so Romanus Diogenes, after he's taken out, you have the Ducas family return. After the Ducas family, you get the emperor before Alexios, which is Nikephoros Diogenes. Nikephoros Botanides. Nikephoros Botanides was a old military general. He basically got his power simply because he was a military general, and that was really about it. He actually revolted kind of in the same way that Alexios would, and got his throne that way, but he really didn't do too much as emperor. He kind of just sat on the throne and didn't really do anything. And that was kind of created the political environment that allowed Alexios and his brother Isaac to really take control of the throne. So yeah, that's really the end right there, is Nikephoros Botanides is really the end of that interregnum era between the Macedonians and the Komneni. So you have really a span of about 30 years or so where there's really kind of a haphazard jumping of various dynasties or not even dynasties, just sometimes even just random people, like you see with Romanus Diogenes.
The Byzantine Empire is slowly having territory kind of nibbled away and at times kind of gobbled away in chunks by these encroaching enemies on all sides, correct?
That's correct. By the time of Botanides, though, a lot of the territory had been lost in Anatolia. So really the shocking thing about his reign is that he did very little to check the Turkish advance through Anatolia. Although the thing that's interesting is that you probably can say that he didn't really have any reason or any power to do it, to stop them, because at this point the army had been smashed at Manzikert. It was already weak before Manzikert. And none of the successors of Romanus Diogenes really tried to do anything to revive the military. It was essentially a lost cause. No one really found the way to be able to pay. At this point, too, you have to realize that there was a huge amount of debasement in the currency. The Byzantine Byzantine economy was starting to falter. And so you have a really tough situation that's inherited by Alexios when he finally comes to the throne. But it's really Alexios who has the drive to solve all the problems, whereas all of his predecessors did not have the drive to do it. They really were ineffective in that role.
So at this point, I think we come to the ascension of Alexios and essentially the establishment of the Komnenian Dynasties. So who was Alexios? Where did he come from? How did he come to power? What did he have for breakfast?
Okay, so Alexios Komnenos. Alexios started, according to Anna Komnena, who was his daughter. Alexios came to power, he started his rise to power during the time of Romanos Diogenes. So as we talked about before, Romanos Diogenes succeeded Constantine Ducas, and actually reigned, and I should have mentioned this before, he reigned alongside Michael VII Ducas, because Michael VII, he wasn't really a military leader, so, and Romanos filled that gap, right? So the thing is, Romanos apparently was the one who appointed Alexios as a general during that time. It might have been right after. It might have been shortly after Romanos' time, but it was during that early 1070s period. It's really unclear from the Alexiad exactly when it happened, because Anna kind of just makes a comment that Alexios had always really been a good military leader. That's what she basically says in the beginnings of the Alexiad. But really, he had distinguished himself in battle, and I guess his family had been distinguished in battle, as we know that Isaac Komnenos, the previous emperor from 1057 to 1059, was a very pragmatic, very effective leader, as far as we can tell. So it kind of ran in his blood. As we are told in the Alexiad, Alexios' brother Manuel was killed fighting the Turks during that time. And so Alexios kind of took the role of the kind of leading general of his family, so to speak. It was during that time that he had fought the Turks and he had distinguished himself. And from, I think, the Zonaras narrative, which is probably one of the other great narratives besides Anna's Alexiad, we're told that Alexios had done some of the defensive work as the Turks were invading the western part of Anatolia. So he was kind of like doing what he could to halt their advance, but he didn't have enough troops to do it, so he just kept falling back and falling back and falling back. But anyways, it's actually a kind of an interesting parallel with his predecessor way back in the past, because Manuel Eradicos Komnenos was actually, he was known under Basil II for his defense. He became known for his defense of Nicaea, which, of course, Nicaea is a city. It was one of the great cities of Byzantium, and it was in that same region that Alexios was defending. And Nicaea would actually feature pretty prominently in the later narrative when we get into Alexios' involvement in the Crusades. So it's kind of an interesting parallel to get into that. But as time went on, Alexios was extremely young when he got his generalship. It's from the narrative, it seems that he was somewhere around 14 or 15 years old when he was appointed. And this tells us some interesting stuff about this period of time in Byzantine history. As we know, the army had basically been smashed. There was very little ability for the Byzantine state to raise an effective army. There was a small contingent of the Varangian Guard that we do know did exist at that period, because we know that Alexios brought a few of them into battle at Dyrrhachion, which we'll get into a few minutes. But most of the other forces, the Imperial Tagmata, which I'll explain. The Imperial Tagmata is the professional standing army that was under direct control of the emperor, as opposed to the Thymata, which were the, as we said before, kind of the provincial armies, which had, at this point in history, had started to really kind of, fall apart. They really did not play a very prominent role. But anyways, getting back to Alexios. So he was appointed the Megas Domestikos, which is the Grand Domestic in English, but it really was the supreme commander of all armies. He was the Megas Domestikos of I believe the East. So he was really the supreme commander by, I think, somewhere around 20 probably. He was not very old when he got the supreme commander position. Now, again, what we were talking about was that that tells us some interesting stuff about the Byzantines at this point. So if they're appointing a 15-year-old to be their general, we obviously can tell that there is a serious deficiency of generals at this point. And that pretty much can be supported by the fact that not only was the army completely ineffective at stopping the Turks, but also we find that there are very few leaders that are capable of leading armies. For example, you have Botanides, who we talked about before. He was an old man, and he was brought in as, he took control simply because he knew how to lead an army. Essentially, that's what we're getting at here. So again, we see that the dire state of the Byzantine military at this point puts them in a very, very difficult position.
This dire state of the army, was this more about training and being able to pay and equip soldiers, or was there a manpower shortage in the Byzantine territories at this time, or was this more of a political and economic failure?
It was really a combination of everything. Everything you mentioned right there is really a contributing cause to this. As we talked about before, one of the big causes is the fact that the Turks started streaming into Anatolia, and when they did that, they basically overran all of the old heartland of the empire. And the interesting thing about Anatolia and Asia Minor as a whole was that it was the prime source of military manpower. Specifically, by this point, Armenia and kind of the eastern part of Anatolia was the real source of manpower in the Byzantine army. So once that was gone, once that became subjugated by the Turks, and in many cases the people there were either deported or killed, the manpower available to the Byzantine army was vastly reduced. So not only did they not have basically the ability to raise their armies, but they couldn't replenish them either. They couldn't replace any soldiers that were lost. The only places that they could draw from were the western provinces, and historically those western provinces were not as populous because if you think about the Balkans, it's generally pretty mountainous, hilly. There are only a few areas that really were able to be, have a sizable population. Really, Constantinople and the Thracian hinterland is one of those areas. The area of Thessalonica, which was always the second city of the empire, and that surrounding area was another source. And then you might get a smattering from the kind of southern islands, the Cyclades and the area around Athens and Naxos and those areas. But yeah, the manpower is vastly reduced. You also have the fact that the leadership, the imperial throne and the advisors of the emperor were also seemingly ineffective at this point. They didn't really do too much other than they did the classic debasing of the currency, which almost historically throughout the history of both the Byzantine and the Roman Empire was disastrous.
Has never worked, ever.
Yes, never worked. Never, ever worked. So if you ever find yourself in a position of Roman or Byzantine emperor, never debase the currency. So that was another issue. The fact that they couldn't pay the troops so no one really wanted to fight anyways. That debased currency really did a number on the economy at that time. Actually, by the time of Alexios, we'll get into this a little bit, but by the time of Alexios, they were using these mystery metal coins. They weren't gold anymore. They were like this just mix of like whatever they had, lead, iron. It was just like thrown all in and made into a coin. It was, I think, if I remember correctly, reading the economy of Byzantium, which is put out by Dunbar and Oakes. It's, I think, the history of the Byzantine economy or something like that. It basically remarks that the gold content in these coins from around 1081 is less than 2%. So it's pretty ridiculous how they were using all these smattering of coins. Like they used whatever they had. I think they probably counted those mystery metal coins along with the gold coins as pretty much the same thing. So
how is Alexios as the Grand Domestic in the East at this point? How is he managing his army, and how is he managing to both get the necessary men and the necessary coinage to pay them?
Well, here's the thing: he's not. That's the thing. As far as we can tell, and there's very, very little information on this, but as far as we can tell, Alexios couldn't raise anything. He could barely raise an army to fight these Turks, and even if he did raise a couple thousand men, it wouldn't have been enough. The Turks not only controlled too much territory in Anatolia, but they were spread out over such a large area that any attack on them would have been pointless, because they would have been completely surrounded instantly by Turkish raiders. And that's the thing, Turkish raiders were really the thing that that had historically, not only just Turks but Arabs and Pechenegs, that was always the issue with the Byzantines, is that they always had difficulty containing the raiders, because they would attack all different places at once, and the Byzantine army was generally not large enough to deal with them always. And in early years, it was even harder, because of course the Byzantines had focused more on their infantry rather than the cavalry. And sometime around the 6th century, they started to change over towards more cavalry. But even then, it was difficult for them, because they generally didn't have the numbers to stop these invasions. So that was always a difficulty. So Alexios had, as far as we can tell, he kind of just fought a defensive war as much as he could. It was just a tactical retreat, really. Couldn't really do too much against the Turkish hordes, so to speak, that streamed across Anatolia. The only thing that saved Byzantine cities at that point was the fact that they had large walls, but not all of the cities had large walls, so it was easy for the Turks to attack them and siege them and take them quite easily. So there were some isolated pockets by the time Alexios comes to the throne in 1081 that were still under Byzantine control, but they were essentially completely surrounded and couldn't be helped, and eventually they fell. So that was the situation they were in at that point.
So how exactly did Alexios come to the throne? He is this very, very young general and then this very young kind of commander-in-chief out in fighting this slowly losing defensive war against the encroaching Turkish forces. So how did he end up going from that position up into the purple?
It's a great story. The principal part of the story of the rise of Alexios comes to us from Anna Komnena in the Alexiad, and it really is dealt with in the early parts of the story. So the rise of Alexios really starts with Botanides, as I talked about before. Botanides, again, had actually he had taken the throne. He had basically revolted and was able to take the throne from Michael VII. And so what he did was, after he took the throne, he really did nothing. And this was something that, I think was really bothersome to a lot of people, because not only was he old, he was really old, actually, by the time he acceded. He was, I think, in his 70s, which at that time was, really at terminal age, right? He didn't live much longer than, 70, even at, in the best conditions. So, this guy kind of just rotted on his throne and didn't really do too much during his time, other than kind of enjoy imperial court life. But from what we can gather from his reign, we don't really know a ton about it, but what we can gather is that not much was done. The currency was continually debased to its lowest point under his reign. The armies were completely ineffective. Nothing was really done to reinforce them or to solve any issues. And so Alexios, along with his brother Isaac, were serving under Botanides, and I think what they realized was that this can't go on any longer. If this goes on any longer, the entire empire is going to fall into ruin. It's going to completely collapse, because it was getting to that point, from what we can tell. The Turks had already taken almost all of Anatolia, and the currency was so debased that it had no purchasing power at all. It was just used, and people accepted the fact that it was supposedly worth this amount of money, right? But it really wasn't, because it had almost no gold in it. So Alexios and Isaac hatched this plan to revolt against Botanides. And at the same time, we know that there was another general who also did the same, and that was the Megas Domestikos of the West, and that was Nikephoros Bryennios. And it's interesting because Nikephoros Bryennios, we're not sure if it's the grandfather or the father of Nikephoros Bryennios the younger, who was the one who married Anna Komnena, but it doesn't really matter for the narrative of our story. It's just interesting to note that there was another general who revolted around the same time. And so we have Alexios and his brother. Their plan was essentially to win over the Empress Maria of Alania, who had married Botanides, and she was from I think she was from the area around Georgia. She was kind of like Caucasus region, apparently extremely beautiful and voluptuous, they say. And she, basically you can tell that Botanides married her because she was pretty, essentially. But apparently she was actually really intelligent too, because Anna Komnena also talks about how Maria of Alania was an inspiration for her when she was younger. But anyways, so Botanides was kind of oblivious to this whole thing. Alexios actually got Maria of Alania to adopt him as his adoptive mother. And this was something that was somewhat common in Byzantium, but wasn't really that common around this period. So it's kind of like a weird thing that it happened. Botanides should have had some things going off in his head, but as far as we can tell, he seemed to have been senile at this point. So he didn't, he had no idea what was going on. Eventually, there's a story in the Alexiad where Alexios and Isaac are brought to the imperial banquet with Botanides and Maria of Alania and all the leading advisors, and they get this shock at one point, because there's this advisor comes in and whispers something in Botanides' ear, and they thought it was that he had learned that they were revolting against him, but it turned out to be like a message about the Turks capturing, I think, Chrysopolis or something like that across the strait.
A different form of bad news than
they had a sigh of relief. They were just like, thank God, that it wasn't that. So eventually, Alexios was able to gain the support of a number of other nobles who supported, who basically pledged their support and also pledged some troops for him to rise up. And so it was really Alexios and Isaac that were working together at the beginning. Anna Komnena kind of paints it as that they were working together to overthrow Botanides. And eventually they amassed a large enough army, and they marched on Constantinople, sieged it for a short time. Apparently one of the guards opened the gates. That someone bribed them, who opened the gates, let the whole army through. And as is told in the Alexiad, Alexios and Isaac march up to the great palace in Constantinople, and Botanides comes out, and he's in his imperial regalia, and he's like, "What are you doing? What have you done?" And Alexios says, "Botanides, please step down from the throne. We don't want to kill you. We just want to ensure the stability of the empire," or something like that. And so after a long discussion with Botanides, he finally says, "Okay, I will step down," and that was the end of his reign. And he eventually did what most Byzantine emperors did after their reign was up. He went into a monastery and lived out the rest of his short life there. So at this point, no one's ruling the empire. It's kind of like, I guess, ruled by advisors for this point. Although it didn't take too long for Alexios to be acclaimed emperor. But as the story goes, there was a debate over whether Isaac or Alexios should be the emperor. Isaac, I think, was the older brother, so they kind of felt that he might have had more precedence than Alexios, but people, I guess, felt that Alexios was more popular and that he was also a slightly better general than Isaac, and so he was acclaimed as emperor. And there's actually a little story. We don't know if it's true. It probably isn't true, but there's a little story where there was Anna says that there was some soothsayer that came around and that while Alexios was riding down the road that said, he kind of like hinted in his ear. He's like, "We will support you, Emperor Alexios," kind of thing. So they tried to make it into like a prophecy. It's probably not true.
That brings up a pretty good question, actually. So, we've been relying a lot on Anna Komnenos for this, who's Alexios' daughter, I believe you mentioned, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
His firstborn daughter.
Yeah, and she wrote the Alexiad, and she's a fairly famous chronicler of the history of this period. But how objective can we think that she was actually writing at this period? I mean, she obviously had a bit of a partisan slant, concerning she was writing about her father at this point.
Yes. Okay, so that's an excellent question, because it's a question that is very often brought up, especially when it comes to the Komnenian era. The thing is, Anna Komnena's Alexiad is really the only source we have on the reign of Alexios, other than the Zenaris Chronicle, which also covers him. But the interesting thing is that Anna Komnena knew. She actually writes in the Alexiad. She says, and I know people will probably doubt what I say in this book, but I have done my best to make it, as objective as possible. So it's basically what she says in the book. Now, if you take her on her word, it's up to you. But I think that another thing that supports the fact that she is telling, most of the stuff she does tell is actually quite accurate, is the fact that if you mirror some of the things she says with some of the other chronicles of the Crusade, especially when it deals with the Crusade, the Byzantines hated the Latins. It turns out that she is correct in many cases, and in most cases, in fact. Her understanding of the events is right. She does have a few lapses in her explanations sometimes, and sometimes there are actually even gaps where you find, once in a while you'll find, and the name of this place was blank, and she doesn't know. Obviously, she couldn't figure it out. But from what is told to us in not only her text, but also in Nikitas Konaites' text, and also a funeral oration by Georgios Tournikis, it tells us that Anna used a number of sources, like eyewitness sources, for her book that actually provided her with information. So I think as a medieval chronicler, Anna Komnena is probably a lot more reliable than most. So I would definitely say that, I don't have a really hard time trusting a lot of the things that she says. And sure, she probably twists it to make Alexios look better than he was. But I think if you look at the what was accomplished under his reign, I think it's kind of hard to denounce what she says in many cases. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, so maybe not prophecies on the road, but a lot of other factual information included.
Yes.
But returning to the main thrust of the narrative, so Alexios is proclaimed emperor. Basileus, I think, is the term?
Basileus, yep.
Yeah. So obviously he had led this coup to take a more active stance. So I would imagine that, once he ascended to the throne, that he had some ambitious plans.
He had perhaps the most ambitious set of plans that have ever been promoted in the history of the empire. I mean, he inherited an empire that was on the verge of death at this point. As we had talked about before, the Turks controlled basically all the old heartland of Anatolia and Asia Minor. The Pechenegs, which I didn't mention at this point, were bearing down on the Danube frontier. The Normans, under Robert Guiscard, had amassed this gigantic invasion force and was planning on attacking from the west. And, of course, the Byzantine Empire, the people of Byzantium had nowhere to go. And, of course, we have the issue of the economy was in shambles, the military was in shambles. This was probably, as Anna Komnena says, the empire had decreased to its lowest ebb. It was at its rock bottom at this point. I think at one point Anna mentions that sometime in like the late 1080s, Alexios could only muster like 500 men to his banner in the entirety of the empire. That's how bad it was. So yes, Alexios had many, many things to do during his at his accession. He was in probably the worst shape that any emperor could be in. But he was the thing was he was definitely capable, and it will be shown that he was capable of fixing all of the woes that the empire had endured for so long, for really 70 years or so.
So please do show. That sounds like dire straits. How did he go from 500 men to being able to found his own dynasty that is recognized as one of the greatest?
Yep. Okay. Well, here we go. This is the start of his rise. So Alexios, at his accession, realized that first he needed some political allies. Right. He was, the Komnenian family had been, it had established itself, especially considering that Alexios was a relative of a previous emperor. That definitely helped him. And that was something, there's actually some interesting parallels to find with Romanos Diogenes and Alexios because of that fact. You find that Romanos Diogenes was a great military leader too. And he could have theoretically, he could have fixed the problems. And actually, if you look at Battle Manzikert, it was one critical flaw in his plan that caused the entire thing to fall apart. If he had succeeded at Manzikert, he could have been hailed as the new Alexios, so to speak. He could have saved the empire, really. But the thing was, he completely failed. He didn't have the political backing that he needed, and that was really disastrous for him. But on the flip side, Alexios realized that he needed, and he may have even thought about Romanos Diogenes at this point and what had happened to him. And so he realized that he needed those political allies. So there was a decision to be made as to Alexios, of course, wasn't married at this point. He was in his early 20s, and he hadn't been married because he had spent most of his life fighting the Turks. He didn't have any time for that. So he tried to decide who he was going to marry. Now there were a couple women that were available. He could marry the beautiful Maria of Alanya, although she was older than him. It would have been an acceptable alliance. She was a very great statesman, definitely very capable. She was very beautiful. Definitely was still of childbearing age at that point. There was also the choice of, he could have also married Irena Duquesna, who was of the Ducas family, who had two previous emperors, right, and also was a very powerful family in Byzantium. So the alliance of two powerful families would have been great. Maria of Alanya didn't really have the alliance, the power politically, other than the fact that she was very capable because she was a foreigner. So I think Alexios decided, Maria of Alanya is a tempting choice, definitely, because she's pretty and because she's a very capable person. But I think I'm going to marry Irena Duquesna because she has the political alliance that I need, especially to establish this. So he eventually married Irene, and she became his wife, and of course bore him several children throughout his life. And it's actually told that she was actually a very loyal empress, considering the history of Byzantine empresses before. But anyways, so once Alexios was married and he established himself as an ally of the Ducas family, he was finally set himself to some more pressing matters. So this was done really in a very short span of time because Alexios had a lot of things that needed to be done immediately. They were pressing issues. The first issue was the invasion of Roberto Buscar, and that was probably the most threatening thing to the empire at this point. The Turks had kind of stopped pressing forward because they didn't really have the ships to cross the Aegean or the Straits of or the Sea of Marmara, so they kind of stopped at once they got to the shores, and they tried to establish themselves there. So it kind of bought Alexios some time. The Pechenegs were kind of bearing down, but I think they were either paid off or they just kind of stopped stopped attacking for a time. It probably was that they were paid off and did not attack across the Danube because they were given a certain sum of money. This was generally in the past how the steppe invaders like the Avars and the Huns were kept at bay. So it really probably wasn't a sizable amount. But Roberto Guiscar's invasion force was massive. According to Anna Komnenian, it was something like 25 or 30,000 men, and also a massive fleet of 200-something ships. So Alexios had to deal with this issue. He found via intelligence that Robert Guiscard was going to attack across the Straits of Otranto and was going to land somewhere in the vicinity of Dyrrhachion, which is the present-day city of Durrës in, I believe, Albania. So it's kind of at the tip, kind of there's like, the curve of Greece kind of comes up, and then you kind of have the Illyrian coast that kind of like branches off towards the northwest. And so it's like right at that junction of where the land kind of like bends. That's where this is occurring. The thing is that the loss of Dyrrhachion would be a huge loss to the empire strategically, because from that location, the Normans could launch an invasion on any part of of what was remaining of the empire. Remember, all they had was the western section of the empire. So. And one thing that I should mention beforehand was, let's return back to Bryennios. Remember I mentioned that Bryennios was another rebel that had fought, or that had rose up against Botanides. Well, Alexios had to deal with him, too. And so before Robert Guiscard's invasion had really come super pressing, and they were preparing to attack, Alexios had to deal with the rebellion of Bryennios. And Bryennios was he was a very capable leader. He was probably almost the equal of Alexios. And Anna Komnena actually comments that in the Alexiad. She says that Bryennios was just as capable a military leader as her father. So, it's kind of painting this picture that there were these two powers vying for the throne even after Alexios had been proclaimed as emperor. And so he fought Bryennios, and he actually was outnumbered by Bryennios. But the thing about Alexios you'll find is that he was a very, very unpredictable military leader. He found all of these very cunning ways of undermining the power of his enemies. And you'll find that was not only how he dealt in his military actions, but also with his political actions. So Alexios hatched this plan, even though his army was smashed at the first engagement that he had with Bryennios. They actually all basically retreated. But Alexios was able to turn his troops around. He personally led this turn and to restrike at Bryennios while he was pursuing Alexios' fleeing troops, and he was able to ambush the wagon train that carried the imperial regalia, because Bryennios had basically made all these purple garments to kind of support the fact that he was proclaiming himself as emperor, and they captured the horse that had all of the imperial regalia on it, and so Alexios had everyone proclaim that Bryennios had been captured. And so they raised up his imperial regalia, and then all of Bryennios' troops supposedly routed.
Well, it's over. They got him.
It's over. We got him, and no one could figure out where Bryennios was. So they believed him, and so Alexios won the battle, even though he had lost it at the beginning. He won the battle because he had captured that wagon train and had proclaimed that Bryennios had been defeated, even though he hadn't. But the interesting. Yes. It's great. It's absolutely great.
So he was in, I guess, at least a stable position, if not a great position, for when Guiscard came over with his fleet of Normans.
Yes, this is where things got really tough for Alexios. So after Alexios beats Bryennios, he doesn't kill him. He actually, just kind of sets him free and says, just don't do anything, just don't do anything bad. And I think Bryennios was an old man by this point, so he didn't, he had no more ambitions after he had lost his army. So Alexios then turned, of course, to Robert Guiscard and his invasion from Norman Sicily. Unfortunately, by this point, Alexios had exhausted most of its troops. He was only able to muster maybe 1,000, 2,000 Varangians of the original, 6,000. They probably had more than that at the height of the empire, but 2,000 Varangians or so, was not a lot. And then, of course, they had what was left of the Byzantine imperial army, and that wasn't much either. So Alexios probably had less than 10,000 men to face a 30,000-man, well-trained, well-equipped Norman invasion force led by one of the greatest leaders of that era. So, I mean, and it's said, Anna Komnena, kind of, even though she acknowledges Guiscard as a definitely a dangerous and treacherous man, she says that he was extremely inspiring and definitely a fantastic military leader. So, she obviously had a lot of things to say about him, and he was definitely a danger to the empire. So, So Robert Guiscard launches his invasion force from southern Italy. I think it was from Taranto or Brindisi, somewhere there in that area. They crossed the Strait of Otranto, but miraculously, a gigantic storm smashed the ships, the invasion ships, and Robert Guiscard's almost his entire force was decimated by this action. And he himself, according to Anna Komnena, almost died in the crossing. It was only by miracle that he arrived on the beach with a few of his troops and then found his way to what was remaining of the fleet that had crossed. So Robert Guiscard was only left with probably half of his army when he landed near Dyrrhachion.
Perhaps one of the reasons we're not talking about Norman Greece at this point is because of essentially a fortuitous storm.
Yes, yeah, similar to the divine wind, of course, with over in Japan. But yeah, this was the divine wind of Byzantium, so to speak. But anyways, Robert Guiscard's forces were still outnumbered. Alexios' forces were still outnumbered.
It's still a formidable force showing up at the doorstep.
Yeah,
though.
it was still a formidable force. The Normans, in their Latin knights, were known as the most formidable cavalry in Europe. Their knights specifically were heavily feared for their ferocity in battle. Of course, the Normans themselves, as you know from the Normans who invaded England, were known for their ferocity. So and this wasn't really any different. The Normans and the Italian melding of southern Italy was really formidable force. And Robert Guiscard, according to Anna Komnena, she says that he personally trained his troops, and so again, this was apparently a very formidable force. So they landed near Dyrrhachion, and Alexios meets them right there at the Battle of Dyrrhachion, and he loses. He loses the battle against Robert Guiscard. Robert Guiscard takes Dyrrhachion, and he was poised to invade the rest of the empire. And again, another miracle occurs that prevents him from moving forward. Back in Italy, there apparently, after the smashing of his gigantic army, there had been a lot of nobles in southern Italy that had kind of been talking and starting to collaborate together. And so Robert's son, who was Bohemond, had told him about this, and he was like, oh man, I gotta go back, I have to stop this. I can't have rebels while I'm on the verge of triumph. So he felt that he was in a position that he could stop because he had established his foothold in the Byzantine Empire. And so he sent his son, as I mentioned, Bohemond, to go take over for him in Dyrrhachion, and he went back to personally lead the troops in quelling the rebellion that occurred. Unfortunately, he died very shortly after he returned, so there was very little chance that they were going to continue on in Byzantium. Now, Bohemond continued in Dyrrhachion, but he was eventually subdued. It turned out to not be as great of a leader as his father, and so he turned out to basically his forces dwindled out in Dyrrhachion, and he lost control of that region. Alexios eventually recaptured it.
And with that abrupt cut, we're going to have to bring this episode to a close. I apologize. Usually I'm a bit more suave in my editing. It just happened to be that was the best spot to actually break in and stop the Byzantine Basileus freight train that is Amberenia before we went on to even more conquests and exploits. So in 2 weeks, in the next episode, we're going to pick up where we left off with Alexios turning east to face the encroaching Turks who at that point were occupying most of Anatolia. Again, this is a blood and conquest podcast, these two, so there's going to be some interesting battles and tactics coming ahead. Also, we'll go through the rest of the Komnenian Dynasty in the next episode. They're an interesting group of people, and they lived in very interesting times. In particular, we'll cover a lot about the Crusades and the Crusader states and their relationship with the Byzantines, and it presents a lot of what if scenarios where you could say, well, what if these two groups, the Latins and the Greeks, had actually been able to get their cooperate for more than a battle or two here and there. It would have been very interesting to see how that happened, because of course this is the time where the Crusades retook Jerusalem and set up those Crusader states. So it's a very interesting political and military and economic and all sorts of other things wrapped in there kind of time to be living. So Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, as it's a lot of fun making these, and I hope you're enjoying it just as much as I do, and just as much as my guests do. If you do enjoy the podcast, please rate and review us on iTunes. That creates some sort of black magic spell, which gets more people to view it, and therefore more people enjoy what you enjoy, which will validate your opinion. And if they tell people that they enjoy this, and you tell people that they enjoy this, eventually everyone will know about the podcast, and everyone will enjoy it, and you'll be part of some global cult, I guess. I don't know. Maybe you'll just have good taste. So please do rate and review us on iTunes, or tell some friends, or rate and review us wherever you rate and review things. One place you can rate and review us is on the Ask Historians subreddit. During our discussion post, you can give us kind of, just direct feedback there. You can also ask follow-up questions for Ambarinia. He obviously has a great deal of passion and a great deal of knowledge on this subject, so I'm sure he'll be more than happy to go into additional detail on whatever topic you happen to have. So we'll hope to see you there, and if not, we'll see you in 2 weeks when you listen to the next episode.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.